Afternoon, and thank you for joining us at our event today after Title 42 Policies for a More Sensible and Humane Immigration System. I'm Nick Wolf, the Mexico Initiative Fellow here at the Pacific Council on International Policy. The Mexico Initiative works to promote better bilateral collaboration between the U.S. and Mexico, foster public awareness, facilitate expert dialogue, educate policymakers, and ultimately improve people's lives. And I think immigration, the focus of today's panel, could certainly benefit from all of these actions. We're pleased to have two expert panelists with us today, as well as our distinguished and knowledgeable moderator, Camille Mackler. I'll briefly introduce Camille and then turn it over to her and introduce our panelists and begin the discussion. Camille J. Mackler, Esquire, is the Senior Visiting Fellow at the Truman Center for National Policy, where she is working on researching and highlighting intersections between immigration policy, national security, and foreign relations. She is also the founder and executive director of Immigrant ARC, a collaborative of over 80 legal service providers in New York State. In that role, Ms. Mackler works with community leaders, legal service providers, state and local governments, law enforcement agencies, and federal agencies and policymakers to ensure immigrants have access to a fair and efficient immigration system. Ms. Mackler was previously the Director of Immigration and Legal Policy at the New York Immigration Coalition. She has led a number of important campaigns and efforts, including and very relevant to today's conversation, legal efforts to respond to the busing of migrants to New York City and New York State since 2022, and sessions with detained asylum seekers during family separation at the border in 2018. Ms. Mackler is a frequent lecturer on topics of immigration law and policy and has authored numerous reports, op-eds, and articles on federal immigration policy. She has testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the New York State Legislature, and the New York City Council on issues affecting immigrants, and has argued cases before U.S. federal courts of appeals and U.S. immigration courts. She is a graduate of Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service and New York Law School. We are very fortunate to have Camille with us today, and with that, I will turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you. Excited to have this conversation with these incredible panelists, and we have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Nicole Elizabeth Ramos is the director of El Otro Lado's Border Rights Project, a program which conducts human rights monitoring, legal orientation, and accompaniment for asylum seekers at the U.S. Mexico border, and engages in impact litigation that challenges U.S. border enforcement policies which restrict access to the U.S. asylum process. Nicole is also an adjunct professor at Temple University Beasley School of Law and a frequent lecturer at universities and law schools throughout the United States regarding the impact of restrictive border policies on the right to seek asylum. Seth Stoddard is a lawyer and teaches national security and counterterrorism law at the University of Southern California Law School. He served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Borders, Immigration, and Trade, and previously as Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Threat Prevention and Security Policy. Earlier in his career, he also served in the George W. Bush administration as Director of Policy for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and is a member of both the Pacific Council on International Policy and the Council on Foreign Relations. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Title 42 has really dominated the headlines and the news stories and the narrative around border policy for the last many years, and many times rightfully so. But now we are in this post-Title 42 phase, which has been, in some views at least, quite a while in the making. And we're seeing a lot of things still happening at the border and a lot of issues still happening there, and a lot of questions being raised around what does immigration policy, which has really become maybe not synonymous with border policy, but certainly border policy dominates the conversation around immigration these days. What does that look like moving forward? So excited to jump into this conversation. Our format, I'm just going to ask each of our panelists some questions. They'll both answer, hopefully engage with each other a little bit, and then we will leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from our audience. If you have any questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A function, and we will address them as they come. So let's get started, I think maybe with a little bit of level setting. What was Title 42, and in both or either of your minds and experiences, what was its biggest impact? And maybe I'll start with Seth as, you know, sort of the policy overview, and then Nicole with the real practical impacts.
Sure. So Camille, thank you so much for the question, and for good to see you. Good to be here. So Title 42, I think, not to dodge your question, I'll get to Title 42 in a second, but I think you have to sort of think about Title 42 in context. So, I mean, first off, I guess I would say is that, just out of humility here, this is an incredibly complex challenge, the issues of borders and immigration. So if anybody has the right answer or the single answer, let us know. But, you know, for the most part, this is a question of balancing competing priorities in a very emotionally wrought topic matter on every single side. So what's Title 42? So the issue comes before, so let's start before the pandemic. So for the longest time, say from the 1970s until the mid 2000s, the vast majority of migration, so irregular migration to the U.S. Mexico border, so coming between the ports of entry, so unlawful crossings in, people apprehended by the Border Patrol, the vast majority of people doing that were Mexican migrants, and for the most part, economic migrants. And it reached a sort of a peak of migration in around fiscal year 2000 of about 1.6 million people, most of whom, 98% were Mexican nationals. And then as the Mexican economy changed, became a stronger economy, also demographics of Mexico changed, and also the U.S. Doubled the size of the Border Patrol and changed enforcement policies. The share of Mexican migration dropped significantly by around, you know, in around 2008, around the time of the global financial crisis. And there were a few years there where I think the U.S. government officials were patting themselves on the back saying, well, we've gotten operational control of the border, but without sort of considering the broader economic and social factors that were sort of leading to that point. And then starting in 2013, you started to have an enormous increase, first of unaccompanied children, and then ultimately families coming from the northern triangle of Central America, so Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, coming to the US border seeking asylum in the United States. And this number became, and I mean, there's any number of reasons as behind this, both what we would say push factors from Central America, but also pull factors that created different spikes of time. And so when the Trump administration came into power, obviously the Trump administration had a different view of immigration and the border than the Obama administration, certainly the Biden administration. So there were a number of restrictions, especially after 2019, where there was an enormous spike of families coming to the border from the Northern Triangle, where there were a number of policies, including the Remain in Mexico program and the transit ban and a number of other programs and also family separation that the Trump administration tried to impose to impose stricter, more draconian enforcement at the border. And those policies were in place until the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic in March of 2020 gave the Trump administration the opportunity, using a statute, the Public Health Emergency Act, I think it's called. It's a statute from the 1940s that gives the CDC the authority essentially to authorize the border agencies to exclude people from the United States for a public health emergency. And so Title 42 was imposed after the pandemic, and the justification was that we're going to try to prevent the spread of the pandemic in the United States by preventing people without documents or other reason coming to the United States, because if they came in, they have to go into what they called congregate settings, like Border Patrol stations, where they might pass the virus on to Border Patrol agents or other people, and therefore spread the virus into the United States. And so under Title 42, basically the Trump administration shut down asylum on the southwest border, the U.S. Mexico border. And that lasted into the Biden administration, where it was progressively sort of taken away, first for unaccompanied children, and then for certain reasons for certain families. And then, but it continued until March of this year, even though, I mean, the pandemic either was over or it was already spreading wildly in the United States. So the rationale for the original Title 42 rule was no longer there, but ultimately it was lifted in May of this year, May 11th of this year.
Thanks so much, Seth. Nicole, from a practical experience as a lawyer working right there on the border between California and Mexico, what did Title 42 look like for you?
Well, I want to first challenge the idea that Title 42 was done to protect the public health, particularly when we look at what was happening nationally, where millions of people were refusing mask mandates, refusing vaccinations, getting into huge physical altercations and feeling threatened about using a mask, that we needed a policy to protect Americans from places where there were high rates of COVID, when we had among some of the highest rates of COVID in the world. And the idea that asylum seekers may be vectors of disease has some real racist underpinnings that we see throughout American history in terms of immigration. With Title 42, what was interesting, it kept out asylum seekers, but for some time it also kept out individuals with tourist visas who had non-essential travel, but it only applied to those that were crossing at the southern border. So you had tourist visa, and the money, you could fly into the United States. And I know several people that are academics, people of privilege, that were able to visit the United States during the pandemic, even though people trying to save their lives were completely foreclosed from the process. Under Title 42, when we were concerned about protecting public health, we still admitted approximately 20,000 Ukrainian migrants that arrived to the border around March and April of last year, even though the vast majority of the Ukrainian migrants that we encountered in Tijuana were opposing wearing masks and were not interested in being vaccinated. Yet DHS was able to process those individuals despite there being a public health emergency. Meanwhile, many other asylum seekers of other nationalities who were not white were prevented from beginning the process because of Title 42. What it looked like in the ground, for lack of a better phrase, is a death sentence. We don't have enough time in this panel to talk about all the individuals, including babies, that our staff knew, that our staff talked to, that died because they couldn't get across the border, because they had common medical conditions but no access to medical care, which created with unsanitary conditions environments that caused them to die, because their persecutors found them and killed them, because they were kidnapped, trafficked, or murdered while they were waiting because they tried to cross the border and were kidnapped, trafficked, or murdered, or because they just simply crossed the border and no one ever heard from them again. And so for us, Title 42 has never been about protecting public health. It has been about ensuring certain death for a group of people that the U.S. does not seem to be interested in helping, despite its international obligations under the Refugee Convention and the 1967 protocols.
Thank you for that perspective, Nicole. So maybe we can start with you next for the next question, which is what has a return to Title 8 enforcement and procedures meant in that sort of context? And for context, Title 8 is the title in the U.S. Code that that encompasses the U.S. immigration law. So essentially, what has the return to traditional immigration law enforcement looked like compared to what you just described?
Well, there hasn't been an actual return to traditional immigration law. Prior to the pandemic, under Title 8, the agency, CBP, was requiring asylum seekers to place their names on a metering list maintained by Mexican government authorities, irrespective of whether they had immigration status in Mexico or whether they were Mexican citizens that feared persecution by actors within the Mexican government or associated with it. Post-pandemic, and because a federal court has ruled the metering policy to be illegal, the government has instituted a new version of metering through the CBP One smartphone platform that requires asylum seekers to obtain an appointment in order to be considered for processing to enter the United States. This platform excludes tens of thousands of people who are seeking international protection and do need help. including individuals who do not speak languages that the platform supports, which is Spanish, Haitian Creole, and English. And to give you a context of how many people that impacts, last year alone, as a single organization that doesn't have, a $10 million budget, we served 12,000 asylum seekers from 29 different countries speaking 32 different languages. So that leaves out a lot of people from access to the process. And individuals who do not obtain an appointment through CBP-1 are penalized and legally precluded from qualifying for asylum. And so the policies that they've crafted post Title 42 and to be in compliance with the federal court order on metering have the same effect of deterring and delaying asylum seekers from entering to the US. And it's not for reasons of capacity, although the agency will frequently state to Congress and the public that they lack the capacity to process those who are arriving. However, number one, we are the US government. We are one of the most powerful, well-organized, well-resourced governments on the planet Earth. Number two, we always have a contingency plan at ports of entry for mass migration events. That's something that we learned in the context of our litigation, and that has been confirmed by whistleblowers from within the agency. Number three, in past, when looking at the metering policy, and this is from whistleblowers deposed in the context of our litigation, as well as confirmed by an Office of Inspector General report, have noted that CBP has always had the capacity to process. What it lacks is the will to process people in conformance with its capacity. And so what we're seeing on the ground is continued enactment of policies and practices that deter and delay asylum seekers and continue to place asylum seekers in life-threatening positions. And I'll leave with this one example. One family that we have been working with fled southern Mexico because there were threats against their life. One of the family members was a member of a political party. They were chased by organized crime throughout Mexico. They were in hiding. When they tried to leave Tijuana to maybe go to another country to just try to get out of Mexico, this person was shot on the way to the airport and killed in front of their family. After they buried this person, their family went to the port of entry with the death certificates explaining what had happened, and then they were still turned away. And now we have placed them in hiding. So this policy of deterring, waiting your turn has real consequences for real people.
Thank you, Nicole. Seth, from your perspective, what does a return, leaving for Title 42, returning straight to Title 8 mean?
Well, I think what we're missing, a little bit in this dialogue is, again, some of the broader context here. I think and I think it would be helpful here. I think at the root, there's several things at the root of this problem. One issue is that the United States needs immigrants. We desperately need immigrants. We need both immigrants in terms of, because of our population, in terms of our population growth rate is plateauing. We actually need immigrants. And the other thing is also we need workers in the sense that we have chronic labor shortages in the United States. So there's enormous demand in the United States for migrant labor, for migrants to come here. Enormous supply in other parts of Latin America, but around the world for any number of reasons. Everything from extreme poverty to food insecurity to violence to persecution to war, whatever else, criminal gangs, whatever else. So there's enormous supply of people who want to come here. The question, though, is the process by which we decide who gets to come has broken down. It's fundamentally collapsed. And the numbers in terms of the backlogs of, in our system right now, under Title VIII, the Title VIII system is that essentially people come into the country and for the most part are allowed into the country to, in some sense, there are different twists and turns of this, but to apply for asylum in the immigration courts as a defense to removal for entering the United States. The backlogs now in the immigration courts have skyrocketed from, in fiscal year 2020, the backlog in the immigration courts is about 1.3 million cases that were pending, and that was pretty big. Now it's 2.3 million cases that are pending, of which about 900,000 are asylum cases, or cases that involve asylum. And so it often takes more than a year actually for even when somebody comes into the country and is given a notice to appear. It takes more than a year to even get a court date, let alone have your case resolved. The asylum cases often take 4 to 6 years to be resolved in the immigration courts. And so in the meantime, what do we do with people in the meantime? And the different administrations have had different solutions to this. And this in the background context of a system where the asylum grant rates, depending on where you're coming from, if you look at, say, most recent decisions in 2023, I mean, you might have grant rates for Mexican asylum seekers of 4%, or all the way up to, say, 28% for Venezuelans, depending on where you're coming from and the claims that you're making. So it's not like it is very much of a mixed flow of people who, some of which have genuine asylum claims and need protection, and some of them who do not. So, and then there's also, of course, a certain subset of people who have genuine claims but do not have legal representation, so can't effectively make those claims. So, but the system itself has broken down to the point where it has become itself a pull factor in the United States, because fundamentally, if people are going to be let into the country pending their asylum claims to wait 4 to 6 years and then eventually get work authorization to stay here, and given the numbers of people that ICE actually removes from the country being very, very small, the chances of you actually being removed from the country are pretty small. So at some level, at the source of the problem is we have enormous supply and enormous demand. We have demand for migrants, we have demand for people to come here, and we have an asylum system as well as a broader immigration system that is outdated, under-resourced, and completely broken down. Title 42, I agree, was with Nicole that absolutely the public health was pretextual. It was absolutely, I'm sure I think Stephen Miller and the Trump administration, I think, believed it as a way of control, of essentially shutting down asylum. But I think one should look at Title 42, including the Biden administration's continuance of Title 42 for a certain period of time, is this is a Band-Aid over a system that is essentially broken down. And all the other measures that I think that the Biden administration have put in place since the end of Title 42 are just different Band-Aids, but the system itself is still bleeding enormously.
Thank you, Seth. I think that's actually maybe a good way to sort of start pivoting into, a bit of the future-facing questions that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just to start, and I know that you have both addressed this a little bit, but just to go back to you, Seth, just I guess in the order we're doing things right now. What do you think are the biggest challenges with our border policy and our immigration policy writ large? I mean, I think we all agree the system's broken. Some say it's sabotaged. It's the dialogue doesn't seem to be moving anywhere, at least nowhere constructive ever. And so but beyond those sort of like bigger, obstacles, what do you think, practically speaking, are the biggest challenges right now?
I mean, honestly, I think the biggest challenge that we face on this issue is the lack of anything close to political consensus on, I think you have a group of people in the country who essentially are saying, we don't want any more immigrants, whether legal or illegal. And then you have a group of people in the country who say, essentially, everybody deserves to come here. And then you have, I think a lot of people in the middle who don't really know, and I think probably when push comes to shove, probably tilt on the side of more law and order. And I think the American people, I think we are obviously a nation of immigrants, but immigration, I think, is generally popular in hindsight rather than when it's happening. And the other thing is also, I think just speaking as a Californian, having lived through the kind of rough debate over Proposition 187 and all that, I think people are going to be more pro-immigrant if they feel like there is some semblance of orderly process to allow people to get here. So I think the biggest problem that I think we face is the lack of political consensus over a sustainable approach that, and you think about the various measures that the Biden administration has put in place since the end of Title 42, including humanitarian parole, for large numbers of people from Venezuela and Cuba and Haiti and Nicaragua, and now the new program with regard to family unification for people from the Northern Triangle, as well as Colombia, also Ukrainians and others. These are ways of using parole and other systems to allow people to come in here and essentially almost bypass the entire asylum system, although people, if they want asylum, have to apply within a year. that, you know, have been challenged in the courts, and I think probably they'll survive in the courts, but I don't know. And they're also trying to, I think the other actor that we haven't really talked about here is the role of the human smuggling organizations and the trafficking organizations. And I think that's another area where the Biden administration are trying to channel the flow of asylum seekers through the ports of entry rather than people crossing the Rio Grande or the incredibly hot deserts here in July, to channel people through the ports of entry to reduce the role of the smuggling organizations and reduce migrant deaths at the end of the day. And sure, there are enormous challenges in implementing that. I mean, I think CBP1 has been, you know, like any government program, I think it's a challenge. It's been challenging technically. The other thing is also just the simple fact that there are only so many CBP officers at ports of entry and only so many people who can interview people within a 23-hour period in a day. So there's going to be backlogs, and that's what's happening right now. And it's stranding people in northern Mexico as a result.
Thanks. Nicole, same question to you. What do you think the biggest challenges on the ground are right now? And I will just point out to the attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A tab and we'll get to them in a bit.
I think one of the biggest challenges is CBP as an agency, their complete dishonesty with the American public and with Congress, as well as the unchecked racism and white nationalism that's allowed to run through that agency. They don't want to process Black and brown immigrants. We processed around 20,000 Ukrainians in under 6 weeks. Many of them did not spend more than a few hours in CBP custody, whereas when we've had processed other nationalities, people who have more melanin in their skin, we're seeing individuals spending days and in some cases weeks in CBP custody, being subjected to some pretty undignified treatment and language. And so I think that there's a lack of accountability and honesty. How can we have capacity to process this many people in this short a period of time from a particular nationality, but not others? CBP's budget has grown enormously over the last 16 years. It's the largest law enforcement agency in the country. I would hazard a guess it has the largest budget, and yet it continually says that it does not have the funds to process people. I also think one of the biggest challenges, if people in the US are not interested in receiving more immigrants, they should challenge our government on its foreign policy and history of intervention in foreign politics, which creates environments that push immigrants to the US, like our involvement in the coup, the golpe de Estado in Honduras in 2009, where we were part of toppling a democratically elected president, like, for example, the thousands of Salvadorans that came in the 80s, and our School of the Americas on Fort Benning, Georgia, trained some of the architects of the violence in that civil war, like our involvement in the 36-year civil war of Guatemala. So if we don't want to receive more immigrants from Central America and Mexico, we should look more critically at our policies and our financial entanglements that produce some of these push factors. I also think that there's a lack of accurate information coming from the US government to immigrant communities about these policies in a language that they can understand. Frequently, immigrants have to go to other sources, and some of those sources don't have very many scruples. And so we create a space where smuggling networks are allowed to operate with impunity because we don't give accurate information. And also because we don't process people at the port of entry as is required upon arrival by Title VIII. And that pushes people to cross through irregular means. And just to touch upon what Seth mentioned as the system being broken, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. But I would just also want to point out that under the current system where people's cases are being heard jurisdictions all across the country, there's no uniform way in which cases are being interpreted. So a person's asylum case will very much be determined by the racism of that surrounding jurisdiction and the racism and biases of those immigration judges. And I also want to point out that immigration judges actually are not real judges. They don't have lifetime appointments. They are employees of the Department of Justice. Many of them are former ICE prosecutors, and their job, security, is dependent upon the whims of the administration that they are working for. And so they can't really be counted upon to be impartial and unbiased arbiters of an asylum claim. And the lack of representation, universal representation for asylum seekers, is also a huge problem. Previously, before this career, I worked in death penalty litigation, and it would be unthinkable to send someone into a death penalty case without competent representation. And many of these cases for asylum are death penalty cases. There are documented cases, even among some of our staff, of clients that lost their case and were sent home and were murdered by the same people that they were fleeing from originally, that the judge determined that they did not deserve protection in the U.S. And so I would also argue that everyone, if they're going to be fighting for their life, is entitled to government-funded representation.
Thank you, Nicole. And as an immigration lawyer, I obviously completely agree, although one day I hope that we're actually advocating to put ourselves out of a job. And I guess that's a good sort of segue, and I'll get right back to you, Nicole, which is, what do you think, as you know, those of us who are pushing for immigration reform, as those of us who are trying to enact change, what do you think the goals of that change, those pushes would be? What do you think that we should be asking for? I think you're muted, Nicole.
I muted myself. I think asylum seekers should be processed upon arrival as they were previously processed upon arrival. I think we do have the capacity to process. We certainly have the budget. We've done it when we wanted to process Ukrainians. So that should apply across the board. But I also question the current system as it is set up, which creates all of these impossible hoops that immigrants have to jump through. And I'll compare Mexico as an example. I'm a resident of Mexico and a citizen of the United States. If I were to have family members that wanted to migrate to Mexico, I would be able to apply for them. It is a matter of an application because we want to promote family unity. And in the United States, families are torn apart through a variety of different immigration laws that some apply to asylum seekers, some apply to people who have been living here for a very long time and have created families here. And if we are a country that is so gung-ho about protecting the family unit and the importance of family, then we have to recognize that all families matter, and tearing apart families in the way that we do through our immigration system will only create more problems for us as a country, because the people that are left behind are going to be more dependent upon the state. They're going to have more mental health problems, and that is going to create for a weaker community, not a stronger community.
Thank you. Before I send it back to Steph for that same question, I do have a question for you, a sort of follow-up, Nicole, which is that a lot of times when we're advocating in the sort of pro-immigrant space, we push back against the idea of giving more funding to agencies like CBP, like ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, but faster processing requires more personnel at the border, right? So how do we sort of align those two? Like, do you think maybe it's expanding USCIS's presence? Is it bringing in other agencies like FEMA, such has been suggested?
I don't think we need more law enforcement. I would hazard a guess that perhaps some of their interviews take so long because they're not qualified to do those interviews with trauma survivors, because they're coming from a law enforcement perspective, viewing people that are coming to the US as potential enemies who are here to do us harm. Instead of investing in militarization, we would do better to invest in medical care and social workers and people who understand how to conduct these types of interviews and are not treating it as an adversarial process. And expanding the number of US CIS officers that can evaluate claims, not putting people immediately in a defensive posture, allowing them to make their claims first to USCIS, I think would be a good first step.
Thank you. Seth, so
Yeah.
question, I guess, right back to you, which is what do you think the goals should be right now in the push for changes? And I would also sort of ask, in terms of the mechanics, what do you think that looks like?
Yeah. Well, before I get to the goals, I just want to respond to a few points, though. I mean, just one quick point. I hear you on, I mean, just to defend CBP here, I don't view CBP, I don't think it's accurate to say that it's a racist agency. I do not think that's accurate. I'm sure, like any law enforcement agency, like any institution, there are bad apples. There are people who are racist, and there's structural racism. But I don't think that CBP or DHS in general, carries out policies based on racism. I don't think that's their point. So I'll stop there. The second thing is also, I think I would contest, Camille, I think when you say that, all of us in the pro-immigrant space, I think I view myself, even though I'm, probably, I'm on the enforcement side of this to some extent, I view myself as pro-immigrant as well.
I think I meant more the grassroots level. I'm sorry, that was poorly worded on my part.
Yeah, but I guess what I would say is that I don't think it's pro-immigrant to encourage irregular migration, or to encourage, or to have a system that is sufficiently broken down that it encourages irregular migration. I think that creates a humanitarian disaster, as we're seeing play out every single day on the border, whether it be people dying in the Rio Grande, people dying in the ocean off of San Diego, or in the deserts, or the 400,000 or so people who are traipsing through the Darien Gap right now, incredibly dangerous territory, trying to get to a point where they can come to the border. And I think, and all the way to, what we see in the United States. I mean, you think about the lax oversight that the administration had with regard to the unaccompanied minors who were coming into the country, that were transferred from CBP to HHS and then turned into foster care in the United States pending their claims. And so many of them were sort of brought into child labor in dangerous manufacturing industry, essentially to pay off debts to smugglers. A lot of them, and many of those kids were lost in the system by HHS. They weren't overseeing them. This is tens of thousands of people, as the New York Times reported pretty devastatingly about 6 months ago. So I don't think immigrants benefit from a process that is overwhelmed or that encourages irregular migration. I think, now back to what we need a system. I strongly believe in, this is why I said that the biggest problem that we face is a lack of political consensus and leadership on this, because I think we do desperately need immigration reform. We need an immigration system, number one, that's going to meet our economic needs as a country. We need more workers. We need high skill, low skill, all workers. I do a fair amount of work here in California. I advise people in the farming industry, like in Sonoma County, for instance. And during harvest times, they can't get enough people through the H-2A visa program or other things, and so people are being paid $35 an hour to pick grapes during harvest. There are enormous labor shortages in the United States. So we need a system that will allow for more lawful immigration into the country. Certainly that. I think I agree wholeheartedly, Nicole, with the emphasis on family unification. I think I do think our system is actually supposed to be geared towards family unification. We don't have a system like Australia or other countries that have a point system that's more focused on skills. It's more, our system at its base is about family unification. The challenge with it is that it's overwhelmed and under-resourced. So you have people in the legal process for spousal visas or fiance visas or whatever else, or other family unification, that could be waiting 10 years for a lawful visa to come to the United States to be with their families. And I think we see that also in I think the inability to address the undocumented population here and regularize and make that population lawful so people can unify in that context. I think the other thing also I would say, we desperately need reform of the asylum system. And that's a tricky process, because I think we do absolutely need to be able to expeditiously resolve asylum cases when they are presented. The problem with it is some of these cases are very complex, and from an evidentiary point of view, people don't necessarily have the presence of mind to bring, sworn statements with them from witnesses of their persecution. So lawyers need to get involved, and I think lawyers need to be involved in all of these cases to help them proceed through the process that we have here, whether the immigration courts, or I think what the real reform I think that needs to be done is building on the rule that DHS implemented last year, but without much resourcing, which is having many more cases resolved by asylum officers at the border, especially the cases that are the easy yeses to be resolved quickly, but also the easy nos. So we can have a smaller subset of cases that are more tricky and need a lot more evidentiary development. So I think we desperately need to fix the asylum system, because right now, I think the problem with the system as it is right now is that we are courting popular backlash to this that we saw with Trump in 2016, but we're seeing in Europe in terms of the Dutch government just fell over immigration issues. I mean, the British government is consistently teetering over its issues with regard to migration. These are highly charged issues politically on both sides. And so I don't think that the advocates like I am, I view myself as very much of an advocate for an asylum system and for the need to protect people who need protection. But I think allowing the system to essentially collapse and be used as a channel for economic migration rather than humanitarian protection is not the pathway to do it. I think that's going to lead to, it reminds me of, there's a great quote from David Frum in the Atlantic several years ago. I think he called his article about this. He said, if liberals need to figure out a way to secure the borders, and or else the American people will hire fascists to do it. And I think that's true. I think I view myself as very much as a liberal and wanting, very much on the pro-immigration side. But I think, an immigration reform has to not only achieve economic and family reality, but also, I think, bring much more law and order into this process to have long-term support.
Great. And so, Nick posed a question in the chat which I was sort of going in the same direction that I was going in. So I'll read Nick's question, which is, if no other questions, with the 2024 election coming up, how likely is it that politicians and policymakers in the US can find the political consensus to undertake the needed reforms? And I was going to get slightly nitty grittier and say, sort of what are the real obstacles inside the Beltway and outside the Beltway that are preventing us from getting to the consensus that we need?
Who you want?
Seth.
Sure. Okay. I mean, I think the chances of comprehensive immigration reform between now and the election are, what's pigs flying? Do pigs fly? I think so. I think that the chances of that are very, very small, unfortunately. And however, I do think, there are probably some areas of nibbling around the edges. I think with regard to, agricultural visas in terms of streamlining those processes or raising conceivably some caps. But I think the problem is, I think this should be a nonpartisan issue as we sort of all look at, all the different priorities that we're trying to balance here. But obviously it's become an extraordinarily partisan issue. And I think for whatever reason, I think one of our political parties has changed its stripes a little bit, or a lot actually, and become, much more of a party that is, not even wanting to expand legal immigration or the ability of people to come here to work, which is, I think it's tragic. I think, certainly earlier iterations of the Republican Party, like under George W. Bush and other people, were a bit more pro-immigrant. But I think even sort of nibbling around the edges of the issues, like on agricultural visas or even some asylum reforms and certainly funding. And I agree with you, Nicole. Also, I do think we need more funding for the immigration agencies, but I don't think we need more funding for CBP. I think if I were to spend more money, I would say, if I had $10, I'd spend $8 of it on more asylum officers from USCIS to actually be able to process more people through credible fear interviews and other things, and maybe some judges as well. But I think the asylum officers are absolutely vital.
And we have a question for you, Seth, but before I get to that, I want to ask Nicole the same question, which is, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to being able to get to a consensus and achieving the reforms that we need?
I don't think either political party is really interested in achieving reform. I think that they use immigrants and the issue as a political chit that they can use to either inflame their base or get support and donation dollars on promises that they will never fulfill. Because I think that the U.S. immigration system and the United States ultimately is a deeply racist country that does not really want more immigrants unless they're immigrants that are going to benefit them economically. I think a lot of people forget that Adolf Hitler was complementary to US immigration policies. The idea of using Zyklon B on Jewish people in the gas chambers, we use Zyklon B on Mexican laborers crossing the border first before they used it over there. And just to touch again, to go back to the point that CBP in our experience is a racist agency. I've never seen unaccompanied children handcuffed before unless they were Black children. I've never experienced unaccompanied children as children be sent to adult ICE detention centers unless they were Black children. I've spoken with hundreds, and now, because I've been here almost 9 years, thousands of asylum seekers who have reported experiences with CBP officers and Border Patrol agents of "you effing Hondurans, you effing Salvadorans, we know you're all liars." While we saw Ukrainians being processed and welcomed into the US, at the same day on the port of entry, there was a Nigerian man with a colostomy bag who was suffering from recent gunshot wounds in Mexico. They let him lay and just bleed on the port of entry floor while they processed white asylum seekers. So I think that the US has a reckoning that it needs to do with itself before anything can really be fixed. And I don't have any faith that either political party is really interested in fixing it.
Steph, maybe while you, well, we all sort of digest that. There's a question specifically for you in the chat, but Nicole, I think you sort of answered it a little bit now too, which is how, given your insights, right, working with DHS within the agency and such, and the policy aspects in Washington, how would you characterize the culture within DHS, and that explains the differences between the implementation of the United for Ukraine program, which is the program that was intended to help Ukrainians fleeing civil conflict there, and Operation Allies Welcome, which was the operation meant to intended to bring in Afghans for help. And of course, it was a lot of the requests that we made, just to sort of explain it for the audience, a lot of requests that we made for Afghans around categorical parole and sort of having a broad class of people being able to enter the United States and be given benefits beyond those who were literally put on planes and evacuated, were not agreed to for Afghans, and were seemingly easily implemented. And I mean, I remember I was at the National Security Council when they announced it, and sort of was one of the voices sort of saying how you justify this, and they, to me, did not have a good answer. But that was the White House, and obviously with all the politics and the trappings of that. And so from within DHS, how do you see that? Because we've seen differences at the southern border and in other places in treatment of these two specific categories and communities.
Are you asking me or Nicole?
You. Well, the question is asking you. Okay, so yeah. Not me. I mean, this is not me putting you on the hot spot.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I was not in DHS when either program was implemented. I do think, in general, I think it's tragic that we were not more forward-leaning in bringing more Afghans here. I think absolutely. Now, I mean, having said that, I think, I think they're all kinds. I mean, there certainly are significant differences in the security vetting, I think, that would go through Ukrainians coming here versus Afghans coming here, given the presence of ISIS, given the presence of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda issues. I mean, I can speak from my experience in the Obama administration, the extraordinary frustration that I felt, and that I think many of us felt in DHS and other places over the 24-month vetting that, at least 24-month vetting that often took place for Syrian refugees. that we were trying to get to the United States much faster. And just the intelligence communities and various communities, the traps that were being run through, including duplicate traps for vetting. I don't know whether that was the issue with regard to the Afghans versus the Ukrainians. I just don't know. I wasn't on the inside. I don't have access to classified information that would get into that. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, I don't have any, I don't have a particular defense for DHS or the administration with regard to the differing treatment of Afghans versus Ukrainians.
I'm going to ask the last question from the audience, and then I have one final question for both of you. And I think this is actually a really great question, and I'm going to let you guys choose who goes first. But the question is, in this debate, is it important, and this is from an anonymous audience member, in this debate, is it important to distinguish between asylum seekers from persecution and those seeking economic opportunities? How are the immigration courts equipped to distinguish between the two? Is it even possible to make that determination? I think Seth is deferring to you, Nicole.
Yeah, as someone who's practiced in the immigration courts, I don't know that they are equipped to distinguish a lot of differences, because I'm continuously amazed by the immigration bench's lack of knowledge about the country conditions around the world. And I personally don't use the term economic migrant because it ignores some of the real harm that the U.S. government has thrust upon some of these nations that have created economic situations that have forced migration, like the signing of NAFTA, which following resulted in an increase in Mexican migration for economic reasons. We have a lot of migrants coming from Guatemala that some might argue are economic migrants, but I think it ignores the role that we played in the 36th Civil War in Guatemala, also known as the Mayan Holocaust, and our tacit cooperation with international companies that deprive local communities in some of these countries of their natural resources that they use to survive, and then it forces them to migrate. And if I could just touch base on the one comment around the difference between Ukrainian and Afghan parole processing. I understand we because of specific security concerns with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, there might be additional vetting, but I would think we also have security concerns about neo-Nazis, and Ukraine has a history of neo-Nazism. We have a white nationalism problem in the United States, and we didn't see any of that kind of vetting happening with that population. But what we're seeing now on the border, for people who didn't get that opportunity to leave Afghanistan, is Afghans that supported our military as interpreters and other types of critical jobs are now crossing the Darien Gap, making this 11-trek country and facing real harm. We just worked with a family who has a child that is disabled, that was tased by a Mexican police officer because the family needed to give that officer money in order to make it further north to the border. This is what we're doing to the people that helped us protect our country from terrorism.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, just to answer the specific question, yes, I think I mean, legally, it makes enormous difference between asylum seekers and economic migrants, in the sense that an asylum seeker has the burden of proving that they are entitled to asylum because of well-founded fear of persecution on the ground, on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. So there are 5 categories for asylum, and that's what the law says. Now, each category is complicated. I think the law, certainly it comes from the Refugee Convention of 1951, which arose out of the horrific experience of the Holocaust and World War II. I think most people think about persecution from the perspective of government persecution of people for, say Chinese persecution of democracy advocates or something like that. But obviously, most of the claims that are coming to the U.S. Mexico border are claims of persecution by private actors, so criminal gangs, domestic violence, whatever else. And the question is, do you qualify under those particular facts of those cases, which are complex cases, for asylum under one of these categories? And the category that most often is litigated is the membership in the social group. I think it's actually pretty vital to separate out between who's lawfully entitled to humanitarian protection and who is a humanitarian, who is an economic migrant. I mean, if one wants to have a distinction between lawful and unlawful migration, I think it could be that we want to have more economic migrants, but I think we can create more lawful channels for that. Now, the big thing that's lurking over this, and I see we have 3 minutes left here in our program, is
and one more question to go.
and one more question, and I'll just say one word and then a little bit around that word, which is climate, in the sense of, I think for all of the migrant issues that we are facing right now, I mean, as we look around the world to temperatures like 129 degrees in Basra or 125 degrees in Mexicali or places like that, extreme heat all over the world, I think that whatever migration challenges we are facing right now, I think we are going to look back at them in 20 years and think these were the good old days. Because I think we are on the cusp of some pretty major migration challenges that will require us to probably rethink what we mean by asylum.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, and I mean, I was sort of going to say, just food for thought, definitely not an answer or another question right now, but these definitions of persecution are based on the 1956 Refugee Convention, right? And it's a much different world today than it was then, and
Right.
So. What does that mean when we're looking at the differences? How much persecution arises out of economic instability? How much of that economic instability arises out of persecution? And what are the driving factors behind migration and the movement of people? I mean, over 100 million people. Oh, yeah, over 100 million people in the world today are displaced. My last question in the 60 seconds that we have left, although apparently we have maybe 180, is to each of you, what is one thing that our audience members can do today to change the dialogue, to change the conversation on immigration, get us to somewhere with meaningful change?
I would think people should ask themselves, are they informed? What are their sources of information outside of corporate media? Are they following organizations that are regularly producing content, updates about what are the changes in immigration policy and who that might impact and how they might be impacted? And then people should ask themselves, what are they personally doing? We like to think about sometimes ourselves in a historical perspective. I wonder what I would have done if the Nazis were here. Would I have hid Jewish people in my basement? And I think people need to ask, what are they doing for immigrant communities? How are they trying to work with immigrants either locally or at the border? And that doesn't require you to speak another language. That doesn't require you to be a lawyer, because there are all facets of immigrants' lives that people can be supporting, including just helping someone figure out how to get around public transportation or complete a job application or complete an asylum application. And so I would challenge people to follow organizations that are covering this work so that they can stay informed and they're not simply relying on corporate media talking points, which are often influenced by political parties, and also doing something concrete for immigrants, whether even if it's just donating and you don't have the time to explain the bus system to someone. Because if you don't protect other people's rights when it's your turn, no one is going to be there to protect you.
Nicole, Seth, last word.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I think probably the most important thing that people could do is get off social media. Get off, because I think, get off social media and actually start talking to people in person, whether it be in immigrant communities or in, communities that have been opposed to immigrants, or also, talk to people in the law enforcement agencies that are dealing with these issues, and humanize the challenge. Because I think the problem is, a politician, I can't remember who said this, once said that it's hard to hate people close up. And I think it's really easy to hate people over social media and really demonize the other side. And, say, either side is evil or whatever else. And I think these are really complex issues, and they're very human issues that I think it's really important that we get off social media and actually talk to people in person, including in immigrant communities, and sort of see how important immigrants are to our country.
Oh, what a great note to end on. So thank you so much to you both. This has been a really provocative and rich conversation, very thought-provoking, I hope, for many of us, and look forward to future programming. And yeah, have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.